The sun had barely crested over Oak Ridge Park, casting a warm, golden glow that streamed softly through the trees. This light danced on the paved jogging path that wound gracefully through the serene, upscale neighborhood. Birds chirped a lively, cheerful melody, and the air carried the crisp, fresh scent of morning dew, a moment that felt like pure peace. For Amara Griffin, this was the most magical time of her day. Clad in a sleek, black athletic outfit that complemented her focused demeanor, Amara jogged at a steady, rhythmic pace. Her wireless earbuds fit snugly in her ears, filling her mind with her favorite podcast on police reform. She relished these early morning runs. They were her sanctuary, a rare opportunity to clear her head and reflect before the demands of her high-pressure job began to pull her in 1,000 directions. At just 38 years old, Amara held the distinguished position of head of internal affairs for the state police. This wasn't an ordinary desk job. It was a role that demanded courage, conviction, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Amara had earned her stripes by fearlessly tackling corruption and holding officers accountable, an effort that had won her both admiration and animosity. It was a heavy burden, but Amara wore it with pride, knowing that the change she fought for was necessary and worth every battle. Recently, she had moved to the affluent Oak Ridge Park neighborhood, not as a badge of her accomplishments, but as a retreat from the relentless noise of the city. The peace here was palpable, the quiet streets and lush greenery a balm for her overburdened soul. As she jogged, the steady rhythm of her feet hitting the path melded with the podcast playing in her ears. For a few precious moments, the world faded away, and all that remained was the simplicity of the run. But that peaceful morning was about to take a turn. A faint sound intruded on her bubble, the slow hum of a car moving nearby. As the sound grew louder, it pulled her attention, breaking her concentration. Glancing up, she spotted a police cruiser creeping along the edge of the jogging path. Behind the wheel sat Officer Ethan Cole, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. To Ethan, something about Amara, a black woman jogging in this predominantly white neighborhood, just didn't sit right. A veteran of the Oak Ridge beat, Ethan considered himself the unofficial gatekeeper of this community. His father, a high-ranking officer in his day, had raised him to view authority not as a tool for service, but as a weapon to enforce control, his version of order. Over time, Ethan had fully absorbed his father's outdated and prejudiced beliefs, holding on to the notion that certain people simply didn't belong in certain places. As Ethan watched Amara jog by, his biases filled in the blanks, painting her as suspicious. In his mind, she wasn't just jogging. She must have been up to something. With no evidence to back it up, he concocted a story about a suspicious person report. Fueled by his assumptions, he decided to investigate. Flipping on his patrol lights, Ethan pulled his cruiser ahead, cutting off Amara's path. The abrupt move forced her to slow her pace. She raised an eyebrow at the car now blocking her way, a slight frown crossing her face. With a sigh, she pulled out one earbud, irritation flickering in her expression. This wasn't the first time she'd been unfairly stopped, but it didn't make it any less aggravating. Ethan stepped out of his patrol car, his uniform crisp and his demeanor exuding authority. But there was a sharpness to his tone as he barked, "Hey you, what are you doing here?" His voice carried an edge that was anything but welcoming. Amara furrowed her brow, startled by the abruptness of the question. She gestured to her workout clothes and the small water bottle strapped around her waist. "I'm jogging," she replied, her tone calm yet measured, masking her growing annoyance. Ethan's expression hardened. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "We've got a report about a suspicious person matching your description, trespassing, maybe involved in theft. Care to explain yourself?" The accusation hung in the air like a slap. Amara blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity of the claim. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm but restrained. "I live here. I jog this path every morning." Ethan, however, wasn't interested in her explanation. He folded his arms, his gaze sweeping over her with overt suspicion. "You got any ID on you?" he demanded. Amara sighed deeply, trying to keep her composure. "I left it at home," she said, her patience clearly thinning. "I didn't think I'd need it for a run." Ethan smirked, the gesture dripping with condescension. "Convenient," he said. "No proof you live here, no ID? You know how that looks, right?" By now, a small crowd had gathered, keeping a cautious distance, but watching intently. Some began recording the exchange on their phones, whispering among themselves. Amara glanced at them, a mix of frustration and resolve settling over her. She knew how quickly this could spiral out of control. Taking a steadying breath, she kept her tone even but firm. "Officer," she began, "I'm telling you the truth. I live 2 blocks from here. This is a misunderstanding." Ethan stepped closer, towering over her in an obvious attempt to intimidate. "Misunderstanding," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Look, lady, I don't have time for games. Either you cooperate, or we're going to have a problem." Amara's jaw tightened as she stood her ground. She didn't want this to escalate further, but she wasn't about to let her rights be trampled, either. "Officer," Amara began, her voice low yet imbued with a quiet authority, "I'd advise you to carefully consider what you're doing right now. You're making a mistake." Ethan's eyes narrowed at her words, misinterpreting her calm warning as a challenge to his authority. "Oh, is that a threat?" he snapped, his tone dripping with hostility. "You think you can intimidate me?" Without hesitation, he reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Amara remained perfectly still, her posture calm but resolute. "Officer," she said, her voice dropping to an even steadier tone, "I'm warning you, step back. You have no idea who I am." Ethan bristled at her composure, mistaking her confidence for defiance. His frustration morphed into action as he reached for her arm, attempting to twist it behind her back. But Amara moved with surprising agility, slipping out of his grasp as though anticipating his move. The crowd, now larger, gasped collectively. Smartphones were raised higher, capturing the entire interaction in vivid detail. Ethan froze momentarily, shocked by how easily she evaded him. But his face quickly twisted with frustration, and his voice boomed with authority. "That's resisting arrest," he barked, reaching for his radio in a frantic attempt to reclaim control. Amara stood firm, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that silenced the chaos around them. "No, officer," she said calmly, her voice unwavering. "That's me reminding you that you've just crossed a line you can't uncross." Ethan's frustration boiled over, his anger clouding his judgment. With a growl, he yanked out his handcuffs and lunged forward, grabbing Amara's wrist and snapping the cuffs on with unnecessary force. She didn't resist, allowing him to force her arms behind her back. But the roughness of his grip didn't go unnoticed. Several bystanders flinched visibly, murmurs of disapproval rippling through the growing crowd. "What's wrong with you, man?" "She didn't even do anything," shouted a young man, holding his phone steady as he recorded every second of the encounter. "Yeah, let her go," added an older woman, her hand tightening around the leash of her small dog. The tension in the air was palpable, the crowd's discontent echoing louder than Ethan's commands. "Step back." Ethan barked at them, his voice tinged with panic as he realized how quickly the situation was spiraling out of control. His hands shook slightly, but he clenched his jaw, forcing himself to appear in control. Turning back to Amara, he tightened the cuffs unnecessarily, eliciting a wince from her. She remained composed, her voice soft yet tinged with quiet disappointment. "You're the one making a scene," she said, her words cutting through the chaos like a blade. Ethan scoffed, shoving her toward the patrol car. "You made the scene," he shot back, his tone defensive and brittle. "All you had to do was cooperate." Amara stepped into the patrol car with grace, her calm demeanor only exacerbating Ethan's frustration. She turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his with a look that was equal parts steely and serene. "I warned you," she said simply. "By the end of the day, you'll regret this." Her cryptic words lingered in Ethan's mind as he slammed the car door shut with a little more force than necessary. "Yeah, we'll see about that," he muttered under his breath, grabbing his radio to call for backup. "This is Officer Cole, Oak Ridge Park," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he exaggerated the details. "I've detained a suspect, violent, resisting arrest. Backup needed immediately." The crowd erupted in disbelief, their gasps audible even over Ethan's voice. "Violent? She didn't even do anything," a woman shouted, her indignation clear. "We've got it all on video," a man called out, his phone held steady. "You can't lie your way out of this." Ethan ignored the voices, waving the crowd back with his free hand. "Clear the area." "This is a police matter," he barked, but the command fell flat against the weight of their judgment. Amara sat quietly in the back of the patrol car, her expression unreadable. A faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her lips, one that Ethan couldn't see, but that would undoubtedly haunt him later. She watched silently as he struggled to maintain control, the pressure mounting with every phone pointed in his direction. As the patrol car pulled away, the crowd's voices followed, their words a promise: "This is going online." Leaning back in her seat, Amara remained composed, her calm demeanor unwavering. She knew that the truth would catch up with Ethan faster than he could imagine. Back at the station, Ethan strode through the double doors, his chest puffed with a false sense of accomplishment. But the weight of the crowd's judgment lingered, an uncomfortable reminder of what had just transpired. Shaking it off, he told himself he had followed protocol, as if saying it aloud would make it true. Amara stepped out of the patrol car with grace, her wrists still bound but her head held high. Ethan led her inside, but it was clear to anyone watching, this story wasn't over. In the bustling booking area, Ethan ignored Amara's warnings and the curious glances of his fellow officers. With exaggerated flair, he slapped a stack of paperwork onto the counter. "One for trespassing and resisting arrest," he announced loudly, his voice carrying a smug tone. "She got a little feisty back there." Amara raised an eyebrow, her expression calm, but edged with quiet amusement. She didn't bother responding. There was no need. She could already see the cracks forming in Ethan's overconfidence. Her silence spoke volumes, a quiet assurance that the storm he was unknowingly walking into would hit him harder than he could imagine. Ethan's false sense of victory was about to crumble. Suddenly, the station's main doors burst open with a force that silenced the room. All eyes turned as Captain Marin Blackwood stormed in, her presence commanding immediate attention. Marin was a no-nonsense woman, known for her sharp features and even sharper demeanor. She carried an air of authority that could freeze anyone in their tracks, and today was no exception. A tablet was clenched tightly in one hand, a printed sheet in the other. Her jaw was set, and her dark eyes burned with fury as she marched straight toward the booking desk. "Cole," she barked, her voice cutting through the hum of the station like a whip. Ethan froze mid-sentence, his pen hovering uselessly over the paperwork. The smirk that had been plastered on his face moments earlier vanished instantly. He turned to face Marin, a nervous smile creeping onto his lips. Captain Blackwood," he stammered, his voice faltering as he tried to steady himself. "I was just processing." "Save it," Marin snapped, cutting him off with a sharp gesture. She slammed the tablet onto the counter, its screen lit up with a live-streamed video. Ethan's heart sank as he recognized the footage. It was of his arrest of Amara, the entire encounter now immortalized online. Within minutes, the video had gone viral, capturing his aggressive behavior and the vocal protests of the bystanders. Ethan's every move, every word, had been laid bare for the world to see. Marin held up the paperwork Ethan had hastily prepared. "Trespassing? Resisting arrest?" "Feisty," she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief and barely contained fury. Each word landed like a hammer blow. "Do you even know who this is?" Ethan blinked, his confidence crumbling further under her piercing gaze. His eyes darted to Amara, who stood silently nearby, her faint smile now more visible, a smile that carried both patience and an undeniable sense of vindication. "She said she lived in the area," Ethan mumbled, his voice weak, "but she didn't have ID." His words trailed off, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "She's Amara Griffin," Marin said sharply, cutting through his weak defense. "The head of internal affairs for the state police department." Your boss's boss, Cole. Ethan's stomach dropped. His face turned a shade paler, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process the bombshell. He glanced back at Amara, his expression a mixture of shock and dread. I didn't know, he stuttered weakly. That much is clear, Marin said icily. Her words carried the force of a sledgehammer. Do you have any idea what you've just done? You've humiliated yourself, this station, and the entire department. Ethan swallowed hard, the reality of his actions finally sinking in. The room was painfully silent, save for the faint murmurs of nearby officers who had gathered to witness the fallout. Marin's piercing glare didn't waver for a second, and Ethan had nowhere to hide.